Hello students, welcome back. Today we're going to be talking about the endocrine system. It's module 10, and as you recall we're going to cover the whole module in one lecture. Okay, so this is a new recording. I am recording in January of 2026, so this is brand new. So we're going to be learning about the endocrine system. It turns out it's super important, and it works alongside the brain. You can see the picture here of the brain because a couple of the endocrine glands are right smack in the brain, and that turns out that the brain and the endocrine system work together to regulate our body. So let's see what we're talking about here. So endo means within, and crino or crino means separate, also secretion. And so the idea here is that from within a gland, something is going to be sent out to a separate place, okay? So down here we see this is kind of representing a gland, and it's going to reach out and be sent out to a specialized target cell that's usually generally far away. So I kind of think of it sort of like a phone call, right? If you're going to call somebody, you're going to punch in a specific number, and you're going to be able to speak to somebody who is not close by, right? Somebody who's generally far away, whether it's very far or just a little bit far or whatever. So that's kind of like what's happening here, is that a signal is being sent out, and just like when you call somebody, you have to have a specific number. The cell that is being affected by the endocrine system has to have a specific receiver, okay? And we're going to see how that works here briefly, okay? All right, let's watch a little overview here in this wonderful video.
Over the course of our lifetimes, our bodies undergo a series of extraordinary metamorphoses. We grow, experience puberty, and many of us reproduce. Behind the scenes, the endocrine system works constantly to orchestrate these changes. Alongside growth and sexual maturity, this system regulates everything from your sleep to the rhythm of your beating heart, exerting its influence over each and every one of your cells. The endocrine system relies on interactions between three features to do its job: glands, hormones, and trillions of cell receptors. Firstly, there are several hormone-producing glands, 3 in your brain and 7 in the rest of your body. Each is surrounded by a network of blood vessels, from which they extract ingredients to manufacture dozens of hormones. Those hormones are then pumped out in tiny amounts, usually into the bloodstream. From there, each hormone needs to locate a set of target cells in order to bring about a specific change. To find its targets, it's helped along by receptors, which are special proteins inside or on the cell's surface. Those receptors recognize specific hormones as they waft by and bind to them. When this happens, that hormone-receptor combination triggers a range of effects that either increase or decrease specific processes inside the cell to change the way that cell behaves. By exposing millions of cells at a time to hormones in carefully regulated quantities, the endocrine system drives large-scale changes across the body. Take, for instance, the thyroid and the two hormones it produces, triiodothyronine and thyroxine. These hormones travel to most of the body's cells, where they influence how quickly those cells use energy and how rapidly they work. In turn, that regulates everything from breathing rate to heartbeat, body temperature, and digestion. Hormones also have some of their most visible and familiar effects during puberty. In men, puberty begins when the testes start secreting testosterone. That triggers the gradual development of the sexual organs, makes facial hair sprout, and causes the voice to deepen and height to increase. In women, estrogen secreted from the ovaries signals the start of adulthood. It helps the body develop, makes the hips widen, and thickens the womb's lining, preparing the body for menstruation or pregnancy. An enduring misconception around the endocrine system is that there are exclusively male and female hormones. In fact, men and women have estrogen and testosterone, just in different amounts. Both hormones play a role in pregnancy as well, alongside more than 10 other hormones that ensure the growth of the fetus, enable birth, and help the mother feed her child. Such periods of hormonal change are also associated with fluctuations in mood. That's because hormones can influence the production of certain chemicals in the brain, like serotonin. When chemical levels shift, they may cause changes in mood as well. But that's not to say that hormones have unlimited power over us. They're frequently viewed as the main drivers of our behavior, making us slaves to their effects, especially during puberty. But research shows that our behavior is collectively shaped by a variety of influences, including the brain and its neurotransmitters, our hormones, and various social factors. The primary function of the endocrine system is to regulate our bodily processes, not control us. Sometimes disease, stress, and even diet can disrupt that regulatory function, however, altering the quantity of hormones that glands secrete, or changing the way that cells respond. Diabetes is one of the most common hormonal disorders, occurring when the pancreas secretes too little insulin, a hormone that manages blood sugar levels, and hypo and hyperthyroidism occur when the thyroid gland makes too little or too much thyroid hormone. When there's too little thyroid hormone, that results in a slowed heart rate, fatigue, and depression. And when there's too much thyroid hormone, weight loss, sleeplessness, and irritability. But most of the time, the endocrine system manages to keep our bodies in a state of balance. And through its constant regulation, it drives the changes that ultimately help us become who we are. If you want to learn more about the ins.
Okay, so that was a nice overview of everything, and we've already talked about hormones already, and we will continue to talk about it in basically the rest of the year, right? When we talk about the lymph system, the digestive system, the urinary system, and specifically the reproduction system. Okay, so that's how important the hormones are. So we don't think of hormones in just reproduction, but there's hormones are basically just guiding everything. It's the chemical way of guiding everything in our body, and it is an elegant system. Okay, it's very I don't know. We're going to look here, right here. We're going to see how it's an exquisite. That's the word I was looking for. It's an exquisite control system that secretes chemicals within the body so as to control tissues that are far away from the source of the secretion. So the gland is in one place, and the target cell with the receptor is in a different place. And it usually gets carried through the blood, almost always, right? All right, works together with the nervous system to maintain homeostasis. And if you remember, homeostasis is the way to keep our body balanced, to fight off any stresses that may come into our system. All right. So here is a comparison of the endocrine system versus the nervous system, since they work together to regulate the body and maintain homeostasis. Okay, so let's take a look at the nervous system over here. We're going to see that it is very fast acting, right? You pull your hand away from a hot stove, right? That happens very quickly. Whereas the endocrine system is very slow action, right? It releases it and it takes a little while for it to get to the target cell, that kind of thing. But because of that, this is very short endurance, doesn't last very long, whereas the endocrine system lasts quite a bit longer. Because if the hormone is in the bloodstream and it goes to the target cell and the target cell reacts the way it ought to, depending on what it's being told to do by the hormone, then it takes a little while for it to get out of your system. So for instance, if you are driving yet, I'm not sure if any of you are driving yet, or if you've been in a car with somebody who's driving and you have a near accident, right? And you or your driver has to slam the brakes on, and boy, howdy, it gets you kind of nervous, right? And so then once it's all over and nothing's happened, you didn't get in a wreck or anything, you still kind of have that nervousness feeling in your body. That's because the hormone is still in your bloodstream. It's going to work its way out. It's going to go out through the kidneys eventually, but it does have that longer lasting situation. All right, in the nervous system, muscles and nervous tissue is affected. Those are the only innervated tissue in your body. And so that's all it can do. But here, all the cells, as long as they have that receptor, they will be affected by the hormone. The nervous system is all or none. It either is going to happen or it's not. And then here, what I mean by more finesse in the response is the idea that in the nervous system, remember, it's not about the amount of the signal. It's about the number of signals. Like, it's not a bigger or smaller signal. It's a increased amount of signals being sent, right? Whereas with the endocrine system, it can send a large amount of hormone or a small amount of hormone. So those are some of the differences between these two systems that are working together. All right, so let's get an overview here of what's happening. All right, so we have here starting with a gland. Now, the gland will be told by generally the brain to send the hormone out, whatever the hormone happens to be. So, boom, it's going to send it to the circulatory system. And that circulatory system, therefore, will then start to distribute it throughout the whole body. Okay, but then the hormone will meet with the target cell, wherever it happens to be. The effect takes place. All right, and so then we have the desired response. Then we can see these arrows going back up to tell the gland the response is good. And we can say here the target cell has now told whatever gland, right here we're looking at the kidneys, the liver, to get the hormone out. Remember, so it takes a little while to get the hormone out of the blood. That's that kind of lingering feeling we have after a stressor. All right, so the action. The hormonal regulation is about secreting the chemical in one location to affect a tissue far away. We've already discussed that. So the glands will, or the cells, secrete hormones into the blood. The video said usually into the blood. I'm going to say 99.9% of the time it's going to go through the blood. The blood carries the hormone all over the body. The target cell picks it up. Now, the reason it's a target cell is because it has a very specific receptor that recognizes it. All right, so you can see this picture right here. If this is the hormone running through the vessel, this is a blood vessel, okay, and then we can see that it really only fits here, right? It doesn't fit in that one, so therefore this is not a target cell, but these it fits in, so it's considered a target cell. That cell is the one that produces whatever effect I want from the cell. So let's go through step by step. You might want to, as these come up, write these down as steps. It's a good thing to, a lot of times ends up on a quiz or a test, okay? So number one, the gland secretes a hormone. So I have a question here. Why does the gland secrete the hormone? Well, something has happened and the body realizes it needs something. Okay, whether it needs the heart rate to go up, whether it needs, salt to be held onto or gotten rid of by the body. Something happens and the brain knows it, right? So the brain will be given a signal to the gland, and the gland will then secrete the hormone. It actually gets quite complex as how the brain tells the gland to secrete. Okay, so there'll be a secreting hormone and a secreting hormone, and etc. We'll get to that here in just a minute. Okay, the blood then carries the hormone to a target cell. The hormone enters the target cell because there is a protein, a receptor. It's usually a carrier protein. If you remember from way back in Module 1 and Module 2, a carrier protein is something on the surface of the cell which takes something big into the cell, right? So generally the hormone is a large chemical, and because of that it needs to have a carrier protein to take it into the cell. All right, the cell will then respond, and when it responds it will send feedback back to the brain to say, okay, thank you, that's all I need, or I need more, and therefore the brain will either tell the gland to secrete more or to stop the secretion. All right, then we have homeostasis achieved, right? So we're back to balance, and this is a good thing. So the hormone is then excreted by the liver or the kidney, and there's a great little, if you read through your book right here, it'll talk about how in urine often is where old hormones will end up. And because of that, a test known as a urinalysis is very helpful to doctors to figure out if there's a hormonal situation. One of the most famous in this case would be a pregnancy test that women can do at home, and it just involves urine, putting urine on a little strip, and the strip will see if there's enough of a certain hormone, which tells the woman that she is pregnant. Yeah, and it's like 99.9% accurate when that happens. Okay, so urinalysis is useful for that. We'll get to that in the urinary system. All right, here's just another picture. I like pictures. I think it's helpful, where we have our secreting cell, the endocrine gland, right? It's got a target. I mean, it's the gland itself, so it's going to send it to a target. So it goes into the bloodstream. The blue thing, purple thing here is the hormone. And then it kind of goes around until it finds, oh, there it is. There's where I can fit the target cell. It's specific, and therefore that cell can then react. This is just another picture showing that the target cell is contacted by the hormone through the bloodstream. All right, so we're going to be looking at the major glands. So I will tell you in this module, while it's a little bit shorter as far as the reading goes and the work goes in it, there are lots of glands to remember, okay? So there's a little bit of memory work that needs to be done. And we're going to go through each one of these, for the most part, in detail. We will talk more about some of them in other places. For instance, when we get down here to the adrenals, pancreas, kidneys, testes, ovaries. These are covered in other modules, right? So we'll be looking at the urinary system soon, one of my favorites, and talk about how the kidneys work and the adrenal glands on top of the kidneys work. The pancreas we're going to talk about that when it comes, well, today we'll talk more about the pancreas, but we'll also talk about the pancreas and the digestive system because it's part of that as well. And then, of course, the testes and ovaries, we'll talk a lot about that in Module 16, what I always call the dreaded Module 16 about reproduction. Okay, so let's take a look here. I thought this might be easier to see. Then in our brain right here, we're going to see we have 3 major glands right smack in your brain, the hypothalamus, the pituitary gland, and the pineal or pineal body. And then in our neck and chest, we have the thyroid gland and the thymus gland. I'm sorry, thyroid and parathyroid here. Thymus is in the lower chest, upper chest, lower body. And then we have our lower body, adrenals, pancreas, ovaries, testes. Okay, that's just kind of give you an idea of how it's working. But specifically today, we are going to talk about the master glands here. Those would be in the brain, the hypothalamus and the pituitary. And then the rest of them we will talk about, but we're going to see how basically the hypothalamus and the pituitary are running the system. They're in the brain, right? So we talked about how the brain will send the signal to the gland to release it. Well, that's where it's happening, in the hypothalamus and in the pituitary. All right, so on page 325 of your book, you will see something that looks a lot like this. Okay, it's talking about the gland. Now, this is not the ones in the brain. We're going to get to those here in just a second and go through it in deep, specificity. But here, if you're going to go to med school, even nursing school, you're going to need to know these kind of things. I don't know how much your instructor or your parent will want you to have memorized for a quiz or something like this, but what I need you to know, the bottom line is that we have glands. Here are the major glands. They secrete hormones, and those hormones have a job. Okay, so for instance, the thyroid has these 2 major hormones here, regulating metabolism. Here we're going to see, look, calcium from the bones gets released or inhibited from release. Parathyroid, releasing calcium. Again, this is going to be about calcium being stored in the bones, which we've talked about in the bone unit. We're going to see pancreas. Okay, it says here islet cells. It's called the islets of Langerhans. They release a very, very important hormone called insulin. You've probably heard of insulin. We'll talk here at the end of this lecture about diabetes. Okay, then we have our sex hormones here, testosterone, estrogen, progesterone. Adrenal cortex. The adrenal cortex is the gland that's on top of the kidneys, all right? And it releases something called epinephrine. And epinephrine, you may have heard of it. It's also known as adrenaline, adrenal adrenaline, the fight or flight response. We'll get to that later in this module. And then also in the adrenals, we have these other things being released, okay? And the pineal or pineal gland is really interesting. It's in your brain. It is basically the gland that regulates sleep and wake cycles. It's a little mysterious still. I will say there's a lot about the endocrine system that we still are making really kind of grand guesses about. We kind of know what happens, but we're not necessarily 100% sure how it happens. And in science, we're always looking for a mechanism to always be able to explain how. All right, so let's go back to our brain now. We're going to be looking at the master gland. That would be the hypothalamus. So the hypothalamus is in the brain, all right? It stimulates the pituitary gland, all right? So we can see here the hypothalamus is in here, and this is the pituitary gland. Okay, so these 2 things right here are the things responsible for basically running the whole show. They're either releasing hormones, like telling a gland somewhere to release a hormone. They themselves actually release hormones as well. But mostly they're sending a message to another gland to release a hormone. Or, in fact, sometimes more often, it's inhibiting a hormone, right? It's decreasing the secretion in the pituitary to just sort of regulate things in a sense that it's going to bring activity down. So you can see right here, this is, we're going to see a little video here in just a minute, but you can see right here that it's sending messages throughout. Here's pituitary, okay, hypothalamus here, and it's going to be sending messages around, okay? All right, so here's our hypothalamus. Here's another part of this chart. So the chart is found on page, I said it earlier, 324. All right, so here's what the hypothalamus is going to have some hormones, and then it's going to have some directive hormones. So the one hormone that it secretes itself is called the growth hormone releasing hormone, GHRH. So what does it do? It causes the increase of growth hormone from where? From the anterior pituitary. So growth hormone, what do you think it does? You know, it says it in its name. It allows you to grow. It causes you to grow. Therefore, it's going to be very active in your growth years, and when you become an adult, less active. All right, look at this. The corticotropic releasing hormone, CRH, to release, guess what? Something from the anterior pituitary gland, ACTH, right? And then we have the gonadotropin, which actually is directly the hormone that increases part of the, this is called the follicle stimulating hormone and the luteinizing hormone, from the anterior pituitary. And then thyroid stimulating to increase thyroid stimulation, also through the anterior pituitary. And then the prolactin inhibiting hormone. So this has to do with this right here, and this has to do with childbearing, right? And then this right here has to do with metabolism. So once again, I'm not sure if you have to, I don't think you should have to memorize these, but just know there's a lot going on in the hypothalamus, okay? We'll talk also about the hypothalamus more when we talk about the digestive system. All right, so here's the master gland. If we think about the hypothalamus as the coach, then the master gland is the quarterback, okay? He's going to make the plays happen. All right, it's hanging down, kind of a little ball hanging down off the end of the hypothalamus right here. The way we say it, it's just inferior or below the hypothalamus. It consists of two glands, the anterior, which is in the front, and the posterior, which is in the back. So while it's one gland, they're really divided into two things, okay? And they do vastly different things, actually. So here you can see it, the anterior right here in the front, right? It's a little bigger, has a little more responsibility. Posterior back here a little bit smaller, hypothalamus right there. All right, so we're going to see that's kind of the anatomy of it here. It's very small. If you do get an opportunity to dissect a brain, typically with my students I would dissect a, you probably already did it, right? I would have dissected a little lamb brain, and you could see just a little tiny, protrusion there that would be the gland. All right, so what is the anterior? So remember the anterior in the front, the bigger one, lots of activities. And here are those activities right here. It's got the growth hormone. Remember, it was told by the hypothalamus to send out the growth hormone. We're going to have growth. It's told by the hypothalamus to stimulate the thyroid. We're going to have more thyroxine from the thyroid for metabolism. We have adrenocorticotropic hormone. Increase the release of cortisol. Cortisol is part of the stuff that keeps us awake, right? It's the happy hormone, they say. Luteinizing for ovaries and testes. It's definitely in the menstrual cycle of females. Follicle stimulating, once again, stimulating ovaries. Prolactin stimulating breasts for milk production. And then the melanocyte stimulating, interestingly, producing melanocytes. If you remember from our skin unit way back, melanocytes are those cells that can be brown, right? They have a brown melanin in there. So if you go out in the sun, you'll get a suntan. And the sun actually tells the brain to make more melanin. All right, the posterior, okay, has less activity, still very, very important. One of the things is ADH, or the antidiuretic hormone, increases retention of water by the kidneys. This is when our kidneys say, hey, I don't want to get rid of any more water. I need to keep it in my body to stay hydrated. And you'll end up with less urine production. There's also an important one called oxytocin. That's part of labor and delivery, known as parturition, and promotes the release of breast milk. Okay, so that's obviously important in childbearing. Okay, now we're going to move out of the brain, and we're going to see what the other glands are doing once the brain has told them what to do. Remember, the hypothalamus is usually telling the pituitary what to do. Sometimes it's directly telling the gland what to do. All right, so the thyroid gland is in our neck, kind of in our throat area, just below. You can see this picture here is our larynx, which is your voice box, right? We'll be learning about that in the respiratory system here pretty soon, which is pretty fascinating. And it looks a little bit like a bow tie or a butterfly. It's sitting right here, and it's so important for metabolism. So thyroxine is the major hormone for metabolism. If you have too much, we can have something called hyperthyroidism, causing weight loss and anxiety, I think your hair falls out and stuff like this. More common, we'll see hypothyroidism, where the thyroid gland is not releasing enough thyroxine, and we have a condition causes weight gain, puffiness, tiredness. Women of a certain age, grandma types, tend to suffer from this malady here. Also, there's calcitonin is secreted from here that is going to change whatever activity needs to happen in osteoclasts. So remember, osteoclasts are those bone cells that break bone down. And why do we want to break bone down? Well, because calcium's being stored there along with other things, but calcium mostly. And so this will allow calcium to be released into the bloodstream. Pretty cool. All right, here's just another picture showing the location of it, the right lobe, the left lobe, and it's just above the trachea, below the larynx. Okay, sometimes if we are not treating our metabolism properly, for instance, if iodine is very important, I think I had that written up there, that iodine is important for correct function of the system of the thyroid gland. That's why some people eat salt with iodine added to it. But mostly you can get iodine from your diet, leafy greens like spinach and kale and stuff like that. So, but if we don't have enough iodine, because we may live in a place where there's not much in our system, we might end up with a problem like this. Okay, so this woman has what is known as a goiter. Okay, and you can see her neck. Now look at that. You can see, if you use your imagination, that is the thyroid gland. Okay, and it's just, the problem is it thinks it has to make more and more thyroxine. Okay, so it keeps producing and producing and producing and producing, and it causes the gland to get very, very large. Now this woman apparently is in a country where she wasn't able to have the treatment for this very easily. It can be treated. Okay, and so, but if we have it in our diet, so I was mentioning these are some of the things where you can find a good amount of iodine to keep your thyroid gland healthy. So we have seaweed, we have codfish in particular, we have yogurt, tuna, eggs, potatoes, that's interesting, turkey, cranberries, strawberries. Okay, so eat the right things and keep your glands healthy. All right, there's another one called Graves' disease. It's hyperthyroidism. I'm producing too much thyroid hormone, and it causes the enlargement of the thyroid and other symptoms. For instance, this right here, the bulging eyes, is pretty common right there. And then, of course, the goiter, right, like the lady showed there. So the goiter can show up for hyper or hypothyroidism. Okay, here's a little video to give us a little more context.
Nestled in the tissues of your neck is a small, unassuming organ that wields enormous power over your body. It's called the thyroid. Like the operations manager in a company, its role is to make sure that the cells in your body are working properly. It does that by using hormones to deliver messages to every single one of them. This high-ranking organ is made up of lobules that each contain smaller cells called follicles, which store the hormones the thyroid sends out into your blood. Two of the most important hormones it produces are thyroxine and triiodothyronine, or T3 and T4. As messengers, the hormone's job is to instruct every cell in the body when to consume oxygen and nutrients. That maintains the body's metabolism, the series of reactions our cells perform to provide us with energy. This hormonal notification from the thyroid gets the heart pumping more efficiently and makes our cells break down nutrients faster. When you need more energy, the thyroid helps by sending out hormones to increase metabolism. Ultimately, the thyroid allows our cells to use energy, grow, and reproduce. The thyroid is controlled by the pituitary gland, a hormonal gland deep in the brain that oversees the thyroid's tasks, making sure it knows when to send out its messengers. The pituitary's role is to sense if hormone levels in the blood are too low or too high, in which case it sends out instructions in the form of the thyroid-stimulating hormone. Even in this tightly controlled system, however, management sometimes slips up. Certain diseases, growths in the thyroid, or chemical imbalances in the body can confuse the organ and make it deaf to the pituitary's guiding commands. The first problem this causes is hyperthyroidism, which happens when the organ sends out too many hormones. That means the cells are overloaded with instructions to consume nutrients and oxygen. They become overactive as a result, meaning a person with hyperthyroidism experiences a higher metabolism, signaled by a faster heartbeat, constant hunger, and rapid weight loss. They also feel hot, sweaty, anxious, and find it difficult to sleep. The opposite problem is hypothyroidism, which happens when the thyroid sends out too few hormones, meaning the body's cells don't have as many messengers to guide them. In response, cells grow listless and metabolism slows. People with hypothyroidism see symptoms in weight gain, sluggishness, sensitivity to cold, swollen joints, and feeling low. Luckily, there are medical treatments that can help trigger the thyroid's activities again and bring the body back to a steady metabolic rate. For such a little organ, the thyroid wields an awful lot of power, but a healthy thyroid manages our cells so effectively that it can keep us running smoothly without us even noticing it's there.
Okay, so there we go. Yeah, so the thyroid is, in charge of the metabolism like that. Okay, so moving on, we've got something called the parathyroid. Okay, so they are actually embedded in the thyroid glands. So we're looking here, the thyroid, these four little yellow things right there are the parathyroid glands. Okay, so there are four of them embedded in the thyroid gland. They release parathyroid hormone, PTH, and they are responsible for the osteoclast activity. Remember about the blood calcium, right? We're going to either increase it or decrease it, right? So in this case, we're going to use that PTH to increase osteoclast activity, to increase blood calcium available to us. All right, so I wanted to show you this bigger picture right here to show you that sometimes when there's an issue with the parathyroid glands, they need to be removed surgically. And so it's kind of a challenge for the surgeon because the surgeon needs to come in. And even also if there's hyperthyroidism, sometimes we have to remove part of the thyroid gland to get less production of it. But we don't want to also take out the parathyroid gland. So they have to take out thyroid without taking out the parathyroids, or sometimes take out the parathyroids without taking out the thyroid. So it gets a little complicated there because they got to reach in there and find the little spots. And, in real life, the glands aren't different colored like this. So they have to be able to locate them because that makes them specialized surgeons for this. In fact, they're specialized for parathyroid surgery. I mean, honestly, they are parathyroid surgeons. Apparently, the most famous one is in Florida. And he's a guy who's developed the way to do this surgery properly. We can see him here as well, right? Once again, we're showing them, kind of over-exaggerating the look of them, but where it's located around the throat area. All right, we're moving down now to the adrenal glands. They sit on top of the kidneys. You can see here are the kidneys that are deep in your back area. They're nice and nestled back there. And then the little triangle on top, a little pyramid, if you will, are called the adrenal glands. We will talk about them now, but we'll also talk about them when we look at the kidneys with more detail, okay? Because the kidneys themselves will release hormones, but the adrenals will release some super hormones. Okay, two glands in one. All right, so here's the kidney, right here, kidney shaped, right? Here's the gland, and then the gland, we have two parts, the outer part and the inner part. The inner part's called the medulla or medulla, and the outer part's called the cortex. All right, so the medulla secretes epinephrine and norepinephrine. You've probably heard of this. Remember I told you earlier, it's also known as adrenaline. This is what happens when you have that near car crash, right? It's also known as the fight or flight response. Okay, so fight or flight would be that I have this hormone release that's either going to make me brave and stand up and face it or run away, and in certain cases, if it's a tiger chasing you, you're not going to stand and fight it, right? You're going to run away from it. But at other times you might, you've probably heard stories about a parent who has, accidentally run over their pet or their child even, and they have the super strength to lift the car up. Okay, that's adrenaline, that's epinephrine. And then the norepinephrine is a similar compound. In the cortex area, the outer part of it, so think when you see medulla, think middle, okay, because sometimes cortex makes you think of core, but no, it's the medulla, think middle. We're going to see that more and more. So the cortex is the outer part right here. It secretes cortisol, breaking down fats and proteins during times of stress. Also, aldosterone influencing the kidneys to retain more sodium. If they retain more sodium, then they'll keep more water in your body to keep us from getting dehydrated. Once again, we will cover that in more detail when we talk about the kidneys and their function in our body, which is module 15, maybe? Yeah. All right, what do we have here? Let's see. Okay, our adrenal glands, there they are sitting atop the kidneys. We have 2 kidneys, therefore we have 2 adrenal glands. And this is just showing a little more detail of the medulla. Some people pronounce it medulla. And then the cortex. This gives you a little more ideas. The other picture made the cortex seem a little too small. Okay, but remember each part of it, that's so efficient for God to design it that way, because the medulla is doing something completely different from the cortex, but they're working in conjunction with one another, and they're listening to the pituitary gland, which is listening to the hypothalamus. Pretty amazing stuff. All right, pancreas. You got to love the pancreas. It's part of the digestive system as well as the endocrine system. When we talk about the digestive system, which is a couple modules away, we'll talk about those digestive juices that come from there. But here we're going to talk mostly about its endocrine function. The other function would be called exocrine. But we're looking at the endocrine function here. All right. So the main thing, you've heard of it, we talk about the production of insulin. There are certain little fancy cells within the pancreas called the islets of Langerhans. And heads up, I always put that on a quiz. So if you have a teacher like me, you want to say what cells are they coming from? You say from the islets of Langerhans. That has to do with the person who helped discover it, Dr. Langerhans. And in there we have these things called beta cells. And the beta cells secrete this large hormone called insulin. Why is insulin so important? It's because it's the thing, the carrier, if you will, the vehicle to get glucose into your cells. Okay, so it's critical, and we'll find out in the respiratory system why glucose is so critical. That's how we get energy, right? We get energy through the production of ATP, adenosine triphosphate, which has to do with aerobic, in other words, air. So I think I've already mentioned to you a couple of times, when we get to module 14, which is respiratory system, it's the most difficult module of the year, in my opinion, okay, because it goes through the Krebs cycle and all that. All right, so the insulin allows cells to carry glucose in for respiration so that metabolism can continue. There's also called these alpha cells, okay? There's different cells. Alpha cells produce something called glucagon, and that stimulates the liver to release stored glucose, okay? So we'll talk about this when we talk about the digestive system, that there comes a time when you're hungry and your body needs to tell you you're hungry. Well, glucagon will be released by your liver, so you'll go break down stored sugar, okay, stored glucose. All very important to keep things managed here. Remember, homeostasis, balance. All right, so where is the pancreas? It's kind of situated behind the stomach. If you can see here, it's kind of nestled in right there. Look at the gallbladder. That's part of digestive. Here's the stomach and the gut, right? The small intestine, all part of digestive. And you're going to see there's a little duct right here, common bile duct right here, that releases the digestive juices. But it's also going to release the insulin into the bloodstream. Here you can see it. So this is the hormones, insulin going to the bloodstream, right, through the whole body. And then right here, we're going to see these specialized cells that make digestive juices that are going to send them out into the intestine. We'll see that when we get to digestive system. All right, so I mentioned diabetes. You might know somebody who has diabetes. The one we talk about is there's 2 different kinds. One called diabetes mellitus. The other one is one that doesn't really happen all that much. But diabetes mellitus is fairly common in the West, especially. Type 1 is called insulin dependent, where the pancreas simply isn't making enough insulin. All right, this is, if you know somebody who's got this type, they have to inject themselves with insulin, every day, maybe multiple times a day. Oftentimes they have to measure their blood glucose level to see if it's time for an insulin shot, this kind of thing. These are the kind of people that don't want to be without their insulin, if they're, stuck in traffic or something and don't have their insulin. They got to make, arrangements for that kind of thing. The more common one is called type 2, called non-insulin dependent. And this is when the receptors on the cells, remember every cell has to have a receptor for the hormone, when the receptors stop responding. So sometimes we'll even say there are fewer receptors, right? They may not literally be fewer, they're just not working anymore. So fewer ones are able to carry the insulin in, and that causes a problem. Typically, non-insulin dependent or type 2 diabetes can be managed through diet. If we eat certain things at certain times, we can get our body to kind of regulate things. It's almost like eating, instead of big meals, you eat smaller meals more often, that kind of thing, so you don't overload this system, essentially. It happens a lot in adults. Type 1, usually you find out when they're a child or sometimes right through adolescence, right in the teen years. I've had students before one student who was 15 years old when he discovered that he was type 1 diabetic. And he had to start injecting himself with insulin. Also, type 2 non-insulin dependent, sometimes it'll get, if people aren't treated properly soon enough, they'll get to the point where they'll basically be both. They'll have to inject insulin as well as manage their diet. In fact, when I teach this class, the lab we would do is we would have pretend patients coming into a clinic to see whether or not they're exhibiting signs of diabetes. And we would do fake urine tests and fake blood tests. It was kind of fun. So know the symptoms. Here we go. Tiredness, frequent urination, sudden weight loss. In fact, the 15-year-old student I had, that's what happened to him. All of a sudden, he was like into bodybuilding, and he just started losing all this weight, and he went and got checked out. Turned out he had type 1 diabetes. Wounds don't heal as easily. They tend to fester a little bit. Hunger, blurry vision, numb, tingling hands and feet. That also is kind of in the same place with the wounds that won't heal. It has to do with the blood supply. You might not getting the glucose to those extremities, right? And we feel thirsty you might feel thirsty all the time. There's another one that your skin might taste salty. That's kind of a weird one right there. People who don't manage this properly, or maybe they're not in a place where a doctor can help them, sometimes they will literally have so little blood supply to their extremities that they will have to have, namely, their feet amputated. Yeah, bad news. And that's oftentimes with type 2. All right, let's watch a little video that will help us understand this a little better.
In this film, we're going to explain how your body processes the food you eat in order to provide all your body cells with the energy they need. And also what happens when you have diabetes and this system doesn't work properly. When you eat food that contains carbohydrate, it's broken down in the stomach and digestive system into glucose, which is a type of sugar. We need glucose from food because that's what gives us energy. Carbohydrate-containing foods are things like starchy foods, sugary foods, milk and some dairy products, and fruit. This glucose then moves into the bloodstream, and the body detects that the blood glucose level is rising. In response to that, the pancreas, which is a little gland that sits just underneath the stomach, starts to release a hormone called insulin. And it's insulin that helps our body get the energy from the food we eat. The bloodstream then takes the glucose and the insulin to every cell in our body that needs it. To make this easier to understand, let's look at muscle cells. At the muscle cells, it's insulin that allows the glucose to get into the cells where it can be used for energy. It's a bit like insulin is a key unlocking the door to the cells so the glucose can get in. That way, the blood glucose level starts to drop. But the blood glucose level can be topped up at any point by the liver releasing extra glucose that it has stored. The blood glucose rises again, and again, the pancreas produces more insulin to move with that glucose through the bloodstream to the muscle cells, open the doors, and let the glucose in. The body functions best with the blood glucose at an optimum level. It doesn't like it if the blood glucose rises too high. Normally, there's a cycle within the body which balances out the glucose and the insulin level, and this is achieved by the food you eat, the pancreas, and the liver. However, in some people, the system doesn't work properly and they develop diabetes. There are two main types of diabetes, type 1 and type 2. In type 1 diabetes, the body isn't making any insulin at all. This is because of an autoimmune response, whereby the body has destroyed the insulin-producing cells in the pancreas. we don't entirely know why that happens in some people and not in others. Type 1 diabetes accounts for about 10% of all cases. It's most often found in the under 40s, and it's by far the most common type of diabetes found in childhood. In type 1 diabetes, the carbohydrate containing food is broken down into glucose as normal. That glucose then moves into the bloodstream. Normally, the body would produce insulin to let that glucose into the cells, but in type 1 diabetes, there is no insulin being produced, so the glucose can't get into the body cells at all. So the level of glucose in the blood rises and rises. The body tries to lower the level of glucose, tries to get rid of the glucose through the kidneys. That's why people who have undiagnosed type 1 diabetes tend to go to the toilet a lot to pass urine. As the kidneys filter the glucose out of the blood, they also take a lot of water with it, so the person with diabetes will get very thirsty. The urine contains a lot of glucose, and that creates an environment where it's quite easy for bacteria to thrive, so it's also quite common to get thrush or genital itching. In the same way, the blood contains a high level of glucose as well, so more bacteria than usual will tend to breed in flesh wounds, and they might be slow to heal. Glucose can also build up in the lens at the front of the eye, causing the liquid in the lens to become cloudy. That can mean that some people with undiagnosed type 1 diabetes can have blurred vision. Because the glucose can't get into the cells to be used for energy, somebody who's got undiagnosed type 1 diabetes is going to start feeling very tired, lethargic, and unable to sort of go about their normal daily routine. But the body still needs an energy source in order to work properly. So what it does is it starts to break down its fat stores, and that can lead to weight loss. So the main symptoms of type 1 diabetes are going to the toilet a lot, thirst, thrush or genital itching, slow healing of wounds, blurred vision, tiredness, and weight loss. These symptoms generally happen quite quickly, often over a few weeks, and can be reversed once the diabetes is treated with insulin. Type 2 diabetes accounts for about 90% of all cases in the population. It's most common in the over 40 age group in the white population, and in the over 25 age group in the South Asian population. Type 2 diabetes is a little more complex because there's slightly more processes at work. Either the body isn't producing quite enough insulin, or the insulin it is producing isn't working properly. That can be due to being overweight, because a build-up of fat can stop insulin doing its job properly, but it can also happen in people of a healthy weight. So in type 2 diabetes, the carbohydrate containing food is broken down into glucose in the stomach and digestive system as normal. That glucose then moves into the bloodstream. The pancreas starts to produce insulin, which moves with the glucose through the bloodstream to all the body cells which need glucose for energy. However, the glucose can't always get into the cells because the locks to the cell doors have become furred up with fat deposits. That means that the insulin can't open the cell doors properly. So the level of glucose in the blood continues to rise. In response to this, the pancreas produces even more insulin. So the blood glucose levels continue to rise and the insulin levels continue to rise. This situation is further complicated by the cells, which are desperate for energy, sending out emergency signals to the liver to release stored glucose. The blood glucose level goes up, and the pancreas produces more and more insulin until it can't cope anymore, and eventually it can wear out. As with type 1 diabetes, the symptoms of type 2 diabetes are going to the toilet a lot, thirst, thrush or genital itching, slow healing of wounds, blurred vision, tiredness, and weight loss in some people. The symptoms for type 2 diabetes come along very slowly, and some people don't have any symptoms at all. So for that reason, people can live with type 2 diabetes for up to 10 years before they realise that they have it. Type 2 diabetes can be treated in a number of different ways. Initially, it may be sufficient to make changes to the food you're eating and to take extra physical activity or lose any weight that may be appropriate. But type 2 diabetes is a progressive condition and most people will need some form of medication to treat it.
Okay, that was very informative. I like the way that it explained why we have blurry vision and why we're thirsty. I like that a lot. So, but like I had mentioned about the type 2 that's more common in older people, the weight thing has a lot to do with it. So even just losing weight tends to be a useful thing in helping with that. Oh, I have something else. What do I have here? Oops, let me go back. See what this is. Is that the same one?
In this film.
Yeah. Okay. Sorry, I had that in there twice for some reason. All right, we're moving on now to the pineal or pineal body, however you want to pronounce it. Remember, that's back in the brain, but it's not really part of the hypothalamus pituitary system, but it is in the brain. So we're going to talk about it for a minute here. It's small. It's somehow sensing. It's a little bit mysterious. Somehow sensing the light-dark cycle, and that light-dark cycle is what is taken in by our eyes. Okay, so we know when it's daytime. Even if you close your eyes, you know that there's light still coming in, right? So during the daylight, it knows to secrete serotonin. Serotonin's the awake, happy hormone. That's a hormone. And during the night, it secretes melatonin. You've probably heard of that. Some people like to take a supplemental melatonin if we're not secreting enough or something like that. I don't know how effective it is, but melatonin is the sleep hormone. Helps us to sleep better. So it somehow controls the sleep-awake cycles. Like I said, it's a little bit mysterious. It has some sort of influence on human reproduction. This is part of the mystery right there. One thing we know, blind people, therefore they don't know that they don't sense light coming in at all. Then their pineal gland might for instance, females might go into puberty sooner. So that's how we know there's something to do with human reproduction, is that because the pineal gland isn't functioning properly because it's not getting the right stimuli, then it somehow affects reproduction. Still mysterious. So it affects the release of the gonadotropin releasing hormone from the hypothalamus somehow. Once again, scientists get annoyed when we don't know the mechanism as to how it's happening. We just know it is happening. Okay. All right, the thymus gland. Now, the thymus gland is pretty fascinating gland. Okay, so here is our thyroid gland, right? Let me get that. Here we go. Right there, thyroid gland, right? And the parathyroid's up in there. The thymus is in the chest, sort of between the lobes of the lungs here, okay? It's active during childhood years. It has something to do with white blood cells being matured, okay? So remember, we called that a thymic education for T cells. We've learned about that already. It prepares the body for a healthy immune system. Now notice here, it says it shrinks away at adulthood, probably due to a lack of nutrients. So for so long, we just thought, well, it's something that happens when we're in our youth, and it kind of sets us up for a nice, healthy immune system. And then as we get older, it just kind of shrinks away because it's not necessary. Well, we've decided lately, and I will say that a lot has to do with the understanding of our human body that's come from the COVID epidemic, is that really our thymus gland doesn't have to shrink away. It turns out if we take the right supplements, we can, quote unquote, reinflate our thymus gland. And those would include vitamin C, vitamin D, and zinc. If you remember back in the COVID days, our very sad days of COVID, that people were taking zinc and vitamin D, right? We found out that almost everybody is vitamin D deficient, at least everybody in America. And so taking a supplement's good, getting good sunshine. Remember, our skin takes vitamin D from the sun and helps to process it, that kind of thing, helps to make it actually. And I think also selenium is one of the other ones that helps to reinflate the thymus gland. So there's a lot still to learn about that. What we do know, if I asked you what's the thymus gland's job, you would say something to do with the immune system, okay, keeping us well. So there's the thyroid, there's the thymus between the lungs right there, just giving you an idea. And then it does have a structure to it where there are the medulla, the middle part, right, in here. And there's these little thymic corpuscles that help release the hormones. And then the capsule area and the cortex area right here. And notice the blood system, because they're going to be releasing a hormone into the system right there. And remember, in those places inside here is where those white cells would come for their quote-unquote education. All right, the reproductive glands. Okay, oftentimes when you hear hormones, these are the only glands anybody thinks about. But as you can see, what we've covered so far, wow, there's a ton of stuff. So, but these are famous, right? So we have the ovary in the female, which is producing estrogen, which is the main female hormone, and progesterone, which is the secondary main female hormone, and then testosterone, which produces, so the ovary would be the functional unit of the female reproductive system. The testes or testicles would be the functional unit of the male reproductive system, making testosterone. All right, but don't be fooled. We all have all of these hormones, but they're going to be more, these will be more in female, this would be more in male. So what about the chemistry of hormones? Did that little video we watched at the beginning talked about that, right? How male and females both have all of those hormones, but females have more estrogen, males have more testosterone. All right, there are three main chemical groups that make up hormones. All right, so we have, this is chemistry right here, we have the amines. They're derived from amino acids, that's a protein. They include things like epinephrine, thyroxine, which we've spoken of both of those. They're in this group, kind of a large protein, if you will. They're derived from the same amino acid, and therefore they elicit similar responses, increased blood pressure, things like that. We have the steroids. These are the most famous, probably, derived from cholesterol. People often say cholesterol is bad for us. No, we need it. It's absolutely essential. These include estrogen and testosterone. And then we have the protein peptides. So these are mini proteins. So the amines might be a smaller protein, if you will, derived from an amino acid, which is very small. And then a mini protein would be several, a longer chain of amino acids. Insulin would be a good example of that. So I'm just going to show you a couple of these. There's melatonin, right? We discussed that just a second ago. It is an example of an amine. All right, and here we're going to see epinephrine and norepinephrine, also amines. All right, so they're small-ish, I guess you could say. And then we have some steroidal ones here. We can see progesterone, testosterone, estradiol. These are a little bit larger. And then we have this one right here would be insulin. It's a little bit longer. Okay. All right, this is part B now. If you were going to separate this into two lectures, you can just end now and then pick this back up later, but I'm going to keep on going. Okay, so we're going to talk about how are these hormones secreted. We know they're going to be secreted into the bloodstream, and how is that going to happen? Let's look at some mechanism here. All right, so there are three main ways. There's the non-hormonal, right? The direct neural being the nerve cells, and hormonal, which is kind of what we've been talking about this time. So this is a stimulus instigates secretion, some sort of stimulus. We'll talk about it in a minute. Direct neural is a neurotransmitter, which is a chemical, also in this particular case called a neurohormone because it's acting as a hormone. And hormonal would be secreted hormone controls secretion of another hormone. That's where the anterior pituitary is releasing a releasing hormone that tells the thyroid to release a hormone, right? So it goes through those kind of multiple steps, if you will. All right, so let's see what we're talking about here. Now, our non-hormonal secretion, what do I mean when I say that? All right, so the pancreas will secrete insulin simply based on how much glucose is in the blood. All right, so there's nothing telling it to do that except that the brain and the other glands recognize how much glucose is in the blood. All right, so that video we watched about diabetes talks about, blood glucose. So blood glucose means the glucose is staying in the blood. It's not going into the cells where it's needed. So people can do a blood test and a urine test because it's going into the urine. If there's elevated glucose in your blood or in your urine, that means the glucose is not going into your cells, right? So therefore, your pancreas is going to want to produce more. Your liver might be contacted to get rid of take that glucagon and get that stored glucose in there, out into the bloodstream again, and just kind of be, this vicious cycle of too much glucose in your blood and not enough in your cells, making you very, very tired. But it's non-hormonal because the pancreas is just sensing how much glucose is in the blood. The blood glucose drops, the insulin increases. Therefore, the blood glucose increases, and then it goes into the cells, so it decreases. Yay. That's where we want to get to. We want to get to that homeostasis. All right. Now, direct neural control. This is interesting. The adrenal medulla, the medulla, stress causes a sympathetic system to release epinephrine. All right. So remember, the medulla is going to release the epinephrine. That's the fight or flight. A posterior pituitary gland axons reach to the gland to release neurohormones, oxytocin, ADH. That's antidiuretic hormone. So the hormone passes through the posterior pituitary. Let's watch a little video to see if we can understand this a little bit better.
Some of neurons in the hypothalamus extend directly into the posterior pituitary gland. These neurons, technically called neurosecretory cells, release neurohormones, which are represented by the red dots in the animation. Those neurohormones are released directly into the veins of the posterior pituitary gland. In the end, then, the posterior pituitary gland is really just an extension of the hypothalamus, because it's the neurosecretory cells in the hypothalamus that are really doing the work of the posterior pituitary gland.
Okay, so you see how that was giving you the mechanism. How is it getting there? Okay, so it's direct nervous tissue telling it to do that, going through the posterior pituitary gland. All right, so we're going to see the second way here, the next way, the hormonal control, where the anterior pituitary gland is stimulated by the hypothalamus and releases it. Basically what we've been talking about. Let's watch a short video on that.
This animation shows you how the hypothalamus controls the anterior pituitary gland. Unlike the posterior pituitary gland, the neurons in the hypothalamus that control the anterior pituitary gland don't extend into the gland. Instead, they release their hormones, the red dots, directly into the bloodstream. The bloodstream then carries those hormones down into the anterior pituitary gland, where they reach the tissues. They then stimulate the tissues to release their own hormones, which are the black dots in the animation. Those hormones are then carried by the bloodstream to the tissues in the body. Let's go through that one more time. The neurons in the hypothalamus release neurohormones, which travel via the bloodstream to the anterior pituitary gland. In the tissues, they stimulate the tissues to release their own hormones, which then go via the bloodstream to the rest of the body.
Okay, does that make sense to you? So where in the direct neural control, it's the neurons themselves are doing it, and here they're releasing the hormone to make another hormone be released, right? So that's what we call it a neurohormone, neurotransmitter, but it's releasing the hormone. So I hope that makes, read that part in your book to get a little better grip on that. All right, our neurosecretory cells, or secretory cells, the neurons in the hypothalamus, they secrete the neurohormone. Neurotransmitters are a little different. The hormone is going to cause a hormone to be released, right? So that's why it's doing it. So here we have our neurosecretory cell, and if that goes into the anterior pituitary, causing them to release the hormone that is needed because the body said I need it. All right, let's look at it in the case of thyroxine. Okay, so our hypothalamus right here is going to influence right here the thyroxine. It's going to have the thyroxine releasing hormone to the anterior pituitary, which will then have thyroid stimulating hormone telling the thyroid to release T3, T4. Our short loop go back here saying we don't need it anymore. Our long loop going back here to say we don't need it anymore. Okay, so that's going to be in your book. I'm not sure what page that is, figure 10.5, page 331. It's just showing you that we can see how it's going to tell the hypothalamus to stop or to continue, right? Making the thyroid stimulating hormone. It's controlling it. So the idea is, how are we controlling this? Well, the body basically is telling you. I like the video earlier told us the T3, T4, the difference in those. For someone to really get a good idea if they're having a thyroid problem, they need to have T3 and T4 both measured. All right, so patterns, we can have constant secretion. For instance, every day we need to have our metabolism functioning properly. So we will have daily constant secretion of our thyroid hormones, okay, dealing with stress. Our body temperature, for instance, might change, and we need to do something to make that better. Sometimes we'll have an acute response. That means something happens and we need to have it right then. So that's the fight or flight, right? The epinephrine, where we're under a stressful situation and our body needs to react. We need to run away or we need to fight. And then we have the cyclic, the ones that are happening in females would be monthly estrogen cycle, and with males would be the daily testosterone cycle. We will cover that in more detail in Module 16. The receptors, once hormones are sent out, there must be a target cell that has a receptor that will receive it. Remember, the telephone has to have the right number. You have to be calling the right number for the message to be received. This is artist's idea of what a receptor might look like. Here's the cell membrane, and here's a receptor up here like this, right, that's going to be able to carry something through it through a complex kind of cascade of events that allows that to go through. So this is known as a membrane bound. In other words, it's on the cell membrane. It's stuck in there. So it's embedded in the plasma membrane. It's kind of the lock and key that was similar to the insulin that we saw in the video there, right? It allows for the active transport. Remember, active transport needs ATP, adenosine triphosphate. It needs energy to open that little locked door, right? It's open. Think of that in the video. When it puts the insulin there as the key, opens the door. Also, large things like protein peptides, other ones need that. The response times are pretty quick. That key pretty much does its job very quickly. We can see it here. Here's our membrane receptor right here. It's membrane bound. We have whatever the blood vessel is sending it out, and it's sending it, so it's opening that door, activating that so that it can do the job that it needs to do inside the cell. I'm seeing if we have a picture of that in your book anywhere. Not really. All right, intracellular. These are inside the cell. I think this picture kind of showed that as well right here. This would be intracellular. Okay, so intracellular receptors. The hormone has to actually enter the cell and travel to the nucleus, bind to the DNA to activate a specified gene to manufacture the protein. So that's pretty complex. That's going to take a longer time to accomplish, right? So it's got to go all the way in. It's got to be able to be let in, go in here and transcribe something on the DNA right there. Wow. It's showing you here, steroid coming in. Apparently steroids are going to do that, come in. It's taken into the nucleus. Here we have the chromatin, activating mRNA and transcription and making basically a code to produce the hormone. All right, there's an interesting deal in the very end. We're almost done here. At the very end of your module, it talks about prostaglandins. It's an important chemical made up of lipids. It's called a parahormone, so it's not exactly a hormone, but it's kind of in the same realm. That's why they put it into this module right there. There are three classes. We have PG1, PG2, and PG3. They're biologically active lipids which produce effects on the body, including smooth muscle contraction. That's this right here. It's good to have smooth muscle contraction of your blood vessels, right? That's going to help to get the blood moving or to slow it down. It causes inflammation. That's this picture right here that's showing there. Sometimes inflammation resulting in pain. We'll get to that in just a minute. And we're going to see here, I'm putting this picture in here to just give you an idea of the things that help to regulate prostaglandin production. This is fish oil, and fish oil is supposed to kind of smooth things over. It's supposed to be very, very good for you. And one of the reasons it's very, very good for you is that it will help to minimize or otherwise regulate the inflammation. So I don't want you to be afraid of inflammation. But sometimes overabundance of inflammation can result in pain, and over time can result in things like arthritis and other things like that. So this right here is going to be our prostaglandin, okay, that's going to help regulate the body right here. So I'm going to put this in quotes right here. Inflammation is good, okay? The reason inflammation might be considered good. So think about this. Look at the picture in the middle. This person has had a bee sting or a wasp sting. I don't know if you've ever had that. Red wasps are wicked to me, and they get really inflamed like this. Okay, but think about it. Look at what color is the skin there. It's nice and red. Why is it red? Because I have more blood cells coming in. If I have more blood cells coming in, I have more white blood cells coming in. Here they're coming on here. They're going to bring down that. They're going to fix the problem. Remember, getting good blood supply to something is going to increase healing time. It's going to speed up healing. And so it's good to get blood there. So in this particular case, inflammation is good for us. All right, but like I said, sometimes inflammation can get overdone, right? Here we have, like if you've ever had allergies where your eyes are all red and itchy, right? There, it's blood supplies there, it's inflamed. but oh, it's miserable sometimes. And all these different diseases here can happen because we have too much inflammation. Okay, so while inflammation in general is good, too much of it causes pain. You may have heard lately about the diet, the anti-inflammatory diet to try to bring down. We don't want to eat foods that increase inflammation unnecessarily. We'll talk about that a little more in the digestive system. So we use things like aspirin, which is an antiprostaglandin, all right? So why does it work? Because it brings down inflammation. If it brings down inflammation, it brings down pain, all right? So that's why it turns out aspirin is sort of a miracle drug, honestly. I had a doctor tell me one time that if it were discovered now, they would have it as a prescription medication because it's so powerful. It also helps to keep the blood from clotting too quickly, things like that. Some people who will, to bring down inflammation, they'll take some on a regular basis, like a baby aspirin every day. I don't know that we're still kind of in that. I think the book still talks about that, but they may have been updated by the medical, community, that it might be a little too much of that, and you might bleed too much. All right, so it's important to keep your hormones happy, and ways to do that is to eat the right foods, including a lot of protein. They show egg there. Probiotics, we're going to talk about that in our digestive system as well. Eat less junk food. So it says here saturated fats. Don't be too worried about saturated fats. In fact, you probably don't, the unsaturated versus saturated. The truth of the matter is we need fat. Okay, fat is important in our diet. Exercise is good, sleep is good, and this I think used to say meditation, but prayer, just to kind of keep your emotions on an even keel, right? To remind yourself, that God's in control and we can trust Him in this whole thing. I like the idea here about getting enough sleep. Probably as a young person, you're probably doing fine on your sleep. I don't know if your grandma, like me, has a little trouble sleeping, and people say, well, go get enough sleep. And I'm thinking, okay, well, thank you. But it's not that I'm not wanting to sleep. It's just I'm having trouble sleeping. So it just kind of happens with age and that kind of thing. But these other things are very good for us. All right, so in the end, the bottom line here is that our hormones are critically important in keeping the homeostasis of our body in conjunction with our brain, keeping everything on an even keel, right? We want to keep everything balanced, and that's the whole point of eliminating stresses. All right, so I hope you enjoyed the lecture, and I'll be back with you next time on the next module, Module 11. All right, blessings to everyone.